sermon today, which is a fun one. Let me tell you why. When Matt said we're going to study 1 Peter, I was like, oh, that's great. Like, there are a few passages in the Bible that capture so succinctly how precious what God has done for us is. Like, he's speaking to a bunch of churches around Turkey, he's speaking probably to a Gentile audience, and he's saying, you guys are heirs of Christ, you're children of God, and he's sharing just what Jesus has done. And so if you read chapter 1 and the first half of chapter 2, it's a really beautiful description of how significant us being brought back to God is. So if you ever want to explain to someone what's so good about being a Christian, 1 Peter chapter 1 is an amazing place to start. It really captures that for us. So I said to Matt, oh, that's great. 1 Peter's great because it really captures all this stuff. But just so long as I don't have to teach the bit about slaves and wives submitting to their masters and husbands. So today we're going to talk about wives and slaves, which is great. And the reason it's so tricky for me, I've got all this experience, I live in a culture, I've got this history, and the more I become aware of history, the worse this gets. And so I've got all these opinions that I want to cram into this passage. Because I feel quite strongly, I bet you're the same. There is stuff I feel about quite strongly that Peter's going to bring up, and I want to cram my opinions into that passage. And so our challenge today, you're going to have to keep your wits about you today, because I want us to be able to hold back your opinions, your culture, your judgments, your experience, and have a listen to what Peter says. That's not an easy task in this one. What he says is truly beautiful, but we've got to hear his words on it, because it's been abused and used incorrectly for thousands of years, this passage. When I was young, who used to record on their VCR off the TV set? Yeah, a few of us. Now, I lived in a remote country. We didn't have a Blockbusters or anything. So we would record a few things on the TV and then watch it over and over and over again. The same movie over and over, because I've only got 10 to choose from. And so that's how I grew up. I filmed a video to film called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a transformational story in the liberation of slaves. But there's a passage that the slave owner, there's this beautiful, big, strong, black, godly man, and through the whole story, the narrative is that whatever happens, he is God's child, and he lives free, but he's living as an oppressed slave. And just watching him through his life of facing all these trials and troubles, at the end, a drunken, super rich slave owner is whipping him to the point of death, where he actually does die of his wounds. And during that time, the slave owner is quoting scripture to him as he's killing him. And he says, slaves in reverent fear of God, he said, doesn't your Bible say, slaves in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. All right? That's a rough place to start. These passages were used to justify slavery, to hold people in oppression, to elevate the minority. And so we're going to read Peter's passage in a minute, because that is not what Peter's intention was. I also lived in the UK for 18 years. Every village in the UK has a beautiful stone church, and right next to it is a probably more beautiful manor house. And the church was used as a tool often in medieval and post-medieval history. It was often used as a tool because God placed the elite. He had them born into an elite family so that they could rule the masses. They believed that all the serfs and stuff, all the people that served them, they were born, and if the rich people weren't there, they wouldn't know what to do with themselves, and society would break down. That was their actual belief. They believed God had born them into this place of prestige, and so they had to keep this order of this small minority ruling the masses across England. That's the feudal system that we faced. So I always struggle when Danny loves Jane Austen. Whenever we watch Pride and Prejudice, I'm like, watching all these toffs dancing around, never done a day's work in their life. I know that just in the valley, you can't see the houses because the houses are down in the valley out of the view of the manor house. And that's where people are living in poverty to keep this elite family in their carriages. All right? So, but these passages were used to oppress. I'll talk about that in a sec. Also, the Greco-Roman culture I'll talk about in a sec because that was where it actually came from. So keep your wits about you today because you could do a lot of harm with this passage. We have, as humans, done a lot of harm in this passage. We're going to be talking about wives submitting to your husbands. All right? Hold on to yourself for a minute because I want to hear what Peter is saying and I want to hear what context he's growing up in. Now, the best thing about this passage is if you've got your Bibles, I'd love you to be coming with me on them today. I actually need to get mine out while I mention it. But in 1 Peter, the first book of Peter, just a tiny bit of a recap. Peter was one of Jesus' best mates, followed him around for 3 years for Jesus' ministry on earth, listened to Jesus' teaching for 3 years, and we'll go through some of those teachings that have influenced Peter. And so here, the nicest thing is, Peter actually tells us why he's telling us this chapter 2 passage. He actually, in chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, and this is, I keep saying this, my problem in the Bible is they put chapter headings in and it makes us isolate passages. Verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2 relate to the next couple of chapters. They're like the heading. Keep coming back to this. This is what I'm talking about. And then he says, and when you're living under authority or when you're as a slave or when you're as a wife submitting to husband, keep coming back to verse 11 and 12 because that's what I'm talking about. So, because one thing we'll have to do at the end of this sermon is work out, okay, how does this relate to me in the 20th century living in Tasmania? All right? And so what we need to work out is what's contextual for Peter at the time, but we'll also have to work out, well, how do I live out what he's trying to communicate here? So he tells us what he's communicating. Thanks, Peter. It's great. If we go to chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, it says, Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. All right, pause for a minute. He's saying, you don't belong here. You're a child of God's. You no longer are just a person of your society that you were born into. You no longer are a slave to Caesar. You're actually God's. So now you live as exiles. You are different. There's a phrase that Jesus is going to say later on, which I'll come to later. I'll save that. So the next verse, so here he says, you're exiles, you don't fit in, you're different. Then the next verse, he actually turns it from that negative of your exiles, you don't fit. He turns it to a positive, and he says, live such good lives among the pagans, the people that don't believe in God, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. All right, so for these next passages, Peter's saying, you're exiles, live such good lives that when God comes back, these people will glorify him. They will have seen God in your behavior and in your choices, in your lifestyle. They will have actually experienced God because of the way you live your life. So that's the question we'll be coming back to at the end of this sermon. How are your lives different? How are our lives different so that those around us, even though they might accuse us of doing wrong, they will actually see God in our actions. So when they meet God, they'll actually look back and say, oh, I remember Johnny, Peter, whatever, whoever it is, I remember that person living that way. And then they will glorify God. So that's what we have to keep coming back to, all right? That's the meaning behind these next passages. So your sinful desires wage war against your soul. Do you notice that's an internal battle for you to manage yourself with God? So your sinful desires will wage war against your soul. We'll talk about that today as well. And then flip it and live such good lives that people will glorify God. Now, last time we thought about how Christians live under authority in society. So Matt talked about how to live under authority, to be able to respect to the authority of the society and its systems that we live under. But now he's actually turning it into the house, and this is how we manage at home. Now, for the Greco-Romans that Peter is speaking to, the home unit was the bedrock of all of society. a healthy Rome starts in the home. You can remember that for the future, all right? Because the way that the home unit is established, then Rome is just a whole bunch of those stones. So the bedrock of their society was strong homes, okay? And then everything built up from there. And Peter writes, the other thing that, before we get into this, is Peter's writing to a first generation bunch of Christians. Now, try and get that into your mind for a sec. I don't know if you've experienced first gen Christian cultures before. I went to Nepal a few years ago. Christianity only really arrived in Nepal in the 1960s. So anyone who's over 30, if they're a Christian, they're a first gen Christian. Now, I'm not going to do this, so don't do this, but if I got all of you to stand up, and then if I said, everyone who was born in a Christian household, can you sit down? Then we will be left with people who have chosen their faith from alternatives and not from a Christian home perspective. So they weren't brought up in it, but they have chosen it. It's actually, even in our culture, that adds a strength to many people who choose Christ later in life. I have many friends. I lived in Oxford, so I have many academic friends, super bright people, who chose God from all the alternatives. And so their faith is really chosen. And I love the determination of their faith and the way it treats their lives. I was born in a Christian home, so I didn't get to experience that. I still chose God, but I was brought into it rather than flipped, if you get my meaning. Now, if you're speaking to a vast culture that's first generation Christian, so Peter's writing to a to current day Turkey churches, they're all first generation Christians. And so they don't know, they weren't brought up to live with Christ at the center of their lives. They've chosen it. And so what that means is there's a few things. They were brought up in the Greco-Roman culture with all the gods and appeasing them and stuff. They were brought up in such a different way that living for Christ is a real flip on your worldview and your behaviour. So Peter's writing to a bunch of exiles because they have changed. You were a slave to your sinful desires, but now you are a child of God's. And in this first generation, that would have meant a lot to his audience. Now, what it means is Peter's actually got to teach them how to live as Christians because they haven't experienced it from others. So they're learning it together as they go. Do you get the difference? So this is a first-gen bunch living in that culture, and now Peter's trying to say, this is how your life should be different. So the first two chapters of 1 Peter are a beautiful description of what God has done, and then the rest of it is, okay, what difference should that make in our lives? If we're following God, how do we actually do it? And how do we make our lives count? Okay, I need to take a breath every now and then. He urges believers in Peter 11:12, he keeps saying, you're exiles, live your life good according to, All right, now the world that Peter was writing to, in the ancient world, household codes were common. There were writers like Aristotle and Xenophon who laid out some of the ways that households should exist. So when I talk about being the bedrock of society, they wrote household codes. This is how you run your house. You can actually go and read them today. They're fascinating. I read a few of them this week. There are significant difference to the way Peter and Paul write. Do you know there are actually 5 household codes written in the New Testament? This is how you should live your life. In your family, in your work, in your society. But the difference is, here are some of them. When Aristotle and Xenophon, I'm going to read out some of them in a minute, it's interesting, but when they wrote to a male audience who were in authority. So he's writing to an audience that is purely the people in charge, this is how you run your house. They're not actually addressing the women, the slaves, the children, because they shouldn't even be in the room. I'm just talking to all the men in authority, this is how you run your home. And so that's how all of the house codes existed. But when Peter and Paul wrote theirs, they actually wrote to women and slaves and children in the audience and addressed them individually. Not individually, but to those people groups. So this is the first time there's a household code that actually is written to an audience of women, children and slaves as well as to the men. And you'll see the differences. In Aristotle, he keeps talking to the men and saying, this is how you manage your women and your children, your slaves. Keeps getting brighter and darker, it's distracting me. But for, what was I saying? Okay, so Peter was addressing the women and children and slaves. Aristotle wasn't. He was just saying this is how you manage a house. Now the other thing is that Paul encourages slaves and women to submit to the head of the household as unto the Lord, reminding both slaves and their masters, this is the important bit, he's also reminding the masters, those in authority, that they share equally a heavenly master who shows no partiality in bestowing eternal inheritance. So Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, we actually studied that last year, he's writing to the slaves and the women and to the masters, God doesn't show partiality, you're all equal, and here's what I'm saying. For example, Paul said, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, for all are one in him. That's in Galatians chapter 3. In the passage we will read today, Peter says, for you are free, yet you are slaves of God. So don't use your freedom as an excuse to do evil. Relationships are transformed. But I also love the dignity that Peter gives to the women. And he linked the women to the sufferings of slaves. He says to the women, be like Sarah, who's the hero of the Hebrew people. And he says, as you submit to your husbands, do it like Sarah did. He's giving them dignity as he speaks to them. Okay. Do you want to hear a bit of Socrates? I don't get to say that in church very often. Okay. Here we go. Yeah, I'll keep going. So Socrates, he said, there's a couple of funny quotes. He said, if you get a good wife, you'll become happy. If you get a bad wife, you'll become a philosopher. They actually say that his wife was one of the most long-suffering women of all history. So anyway, so he became a philosopher. Aristotle said, I've been afflicted with 3 calamities, language, poverty, and my wife. Okay, I'm trying to give you a bit of, these are actually what they were saying a few hundred years before Jesus turned up. Aristotle described the woman as being colder and having less vital heat. I think he's got a point in that. My wife's hands are always cold. So anyway, I don't think I've ever had a bloke come up to me and say it's too cold in this hall. So anyway, he's saying that women, they are colder and have less vital heat. I think, yeah, anyway. But then he went on to say they have less vital heat because they are more passive. Okay, that's a big jump. So I think it's more biological than that. In his biological works, Aristotle described the female. It's going to get serious here. Jenny's doing those Jesus in 60 seconds videos that we put online, and she's not allowed to quote these as my opinion, because these are not my opinion. This is Aristotle. Aristotle described the female as deformed or a deformed or maimed male. Okay, arguing that the female is less perfect than the male. All right? You need to hear what the culture Peter's writing to. That's why I'm reading these. I think it's important. Aristotle said that some people were born to be slaves, while others were born to be slave masters. Can you hear the English feudal system built on that? It's actually built on Greek imperialism. Slavery, he said, was a good thing for slaves because without masters, slaves would not know what to do with themselves. What a load of rubbish, Aristotle. The same holds good of animals in relation to men. Tame animals have a better nature than wild, and all tame animals are better off when they are ruled by man, for they are preserved. Again, the male is by nature superior, and the female as inferior. The one rules and the other is ruled, and this principle is of necessity, and it extends to all of mankind. Can you see what Jesus was writing, what Jesus arrived into, this culture? It doesn't get better. I'm going to keep going because I just want you to get the contrast of how beautiful Jesus' teaching was at the time. Plato states that slaves are a body that belongs to another, a human-footed stock, a creature like a beast of burden. It's a possession, and ruling your home is all about possessions. And so getting good stock, slaves, is how you build your house. Okay? About wives, I struggle reading these because this is not how I live. Anyway, about wives, Aristotle said, Let it be her aim to obey her husband, giving no heed to public affairs, nor having any part in arranging the marriages of the children. Okay, that's where Jane Austen changed it a fair bit. Let her hearken to her husband in all respects. It is fitting that a woman of a well-ordered life shall consider that her husband's wishes are as laws appointed by her divine will, by divine will. He then goes on and says, let her refrain from all complaint. Can you hear how he's talking about her and not to her? That's what I was saying before. Let her refrain from all complaint, no charge against him for wrong, but rather attribute everything to this kind of as sickness or ignorance or an accident. So if the man does something that you think is wrong, he's either not well or he's had an accident. So he was right, just difficult. Therefore, she will serve him more assiduously than if she had been a slave brought and taken home, for he has indeed brought her with a great price. All right, deep breath. I don't know how you're going with those. Now, the interesting thing is, even as I read a bunch of Greek philosophy, you'll have a bunch of opinions that you want to cram in there. But I'm going to keep going because this is where Jesus really turns things around. I love the way that Jesus sees women and relates to them and speaks to them as equals and cares for them. So that's enough of the Greco-Roman culture for now, but that's what it was like as Jesus and Peter were doing their ministry. If we want to understand Peter's household instructions or his code, then we have to read them through the life and teaching of Jesus, because Jesus did not reinforce the worldly ideas of power. He turned them upside down. Jesus turned the way we do society upside down. When the disciples argued about who was greatest, Jesus said to the one who wants to be first among you must be the servant of all. In his kingdom, greatness is not about status, it's about self-giving service. And in speaking to them about authority, Jesus said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. This is the phrase that's really stood out to me, these next 4 words. Not so with you. That's the bit. You are exiles. You are a servant of God. You are free. It's not so with you. That's not how you live. I love Jesus' phrase there. Instead, whoever wants to become great amongst you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's in Matthew 20. How's that contrast feel for you? For me, it's like, oh, thanks, Jesus. That's how I'm living. Whenever we talk about submission and authority, I think it's important to come back to what Jesus taught Peter, because Peter was there listening to all this. So when we read Peter's writings, try and see it with the lens of he listened to all of Jesus' teaching. So bring that with you as you go. This aspect of Jesus' legacy profoundly affected relationships in the early church. And Paul wrote, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And one reason that Peter's words are so strange to us is that in the ancient world, slavery and male dominance were treated as normal. It was desirable, and it was the bedrock of society at the time. Slaves were seen as property, and women were commonly viewed as inferior. That was simply the air they breathed. And so I'd like to read Peter's section today. We're going to read from 1 Peter chapter 2. Oh, I said I was going to bring it up and I haven't. Just bear with me for a sec. We're going to read Peter's writing. So 1 Peter chapter 2. Yep, starting at verse 18. That's what I'm looking for. So 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18. So I'll read this fairly slowly. We're going to read it both sections at once. He's just spoken to how do we live under authority, and he's writing to an oppressed audience. Now he's writing to slaves who are an oppressed audience as well. And then he's going to write to wives who are also at the time an oppressed audience. And the other thing that's worth noting in Peter, I love this framework that he does. He gives, this is why we live like this, and then this is how you live under authority. And then he says, it's going to be tough, you're going to suffer. And then he says, this is why we do it. And if you're a slave, this is how you do it. And he says it's going to be tough. Do you know at the end of chapters 2, 3, and 4, which is almost half of this book, Peter writes about suffering. So he's primarily writing to us, to his audience, about it's going to be tough. You're exiles, you're different, you do life differently, and it's going to be difficult. And it really is. For his audience, they go through so much difficulty. All right, Peter is, in 5 years' time, he's going to be hung on a cross inverted for his faith. He's talking about suffering through these 3 chapters. But he's not talking about escaping that suffering. That's the interesting bit. Let's have a look. So verse 18, slaves. You who are slaves, now just pause for a second. It was about 1/3 of Rome that were slaves at this time. Slaves are, I think today's equivalent, we would say employees in almost the same way, except we have freedom. But it's that big part of the demographic, 1/3 of Rome are slaves. So he's writing to a bunch of them. You who are slaves, verse 18, must submit to your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. For God is pleased when, conscious of his will, you patiently endure unjust treatment. Of course, you get no credit for being patient if you are beaten for doing wrong, but if you suffer for doing good and endure it patiently, God is pleased with you. For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering. Just as Christ suffered for you, he is your example, and you must follow in his steps. He never sinned, nor ever deceived anyone. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross, so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. By his wounds you are healed. And once you were like sheep who wandered away, but now you have turned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls. You can hear the different tone compared to the slave whipper guy that I was talking about. And then he goes on to say, wives, in the same way, we'll break these down in a minute, but I just want to read it straight through. Wives, in the same way, you wives must accept the authority of your husbands. Then, even if some refuse to obey the good news, your godly lives will speak to them without any words. They will be won over by observing your pure and reverent lives. Don't be concerned about the outward beauty of fancy hairstyles, expensive jewelry, or beautiful clothes. You should clothe yourself instead with the beauty that comes from within, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is so precious to God. This is how the holy women of old made themselves beautiful. They put their trust in God and accepted the authority of their husbands. For instance, Sarah obeyed her husband Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters when you do what is right, without fear of what your husbands might do. Now, and then he goes on, I'll read the bit to husbands as well. In the same way, you husbands must give honour to your wives. Treat your wife with understanding as you live together. She may be weaker than you are, but she is your equal partner in God's gift of new life. Treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. And then he goes on. Matt will talk next week about the message to all Christians. And then again he says, you're going to suffer, it's going to be tough. Okay, so Peter moves through several parts of life. Society, work and marriage. And in each case, his point is not that all authority is good or that all suffering should be accepted without question. His point is that believers belong to Christ, and so they are to live in such holiness and restraint and courage that their lives bear witness to him. I'm thankful for the example. We've got Peter and John, I think it is. They go to the temple after Jesus has ascended, and they heal a man out front of the temple, and then they go inside, and the Sanhedrin says, you guys cannot do this. You must not be talking about Jesus. You must be silent on that topic. We'll let you go, but you can't talk about Jesus anymore. Now, that's the authority that Peter was under. He was told by the authorities, you cannot speak about Jesus anymore. Do you remember Peter's response? He said, I can't keep quiet about Jesus. Like he's saying, look, I respect your authority, but I am a servant of God's. I can't keep quiet about Jesus. That's not going to happen. So they beat them and let them go. And then the ministry keeps on going. So we get this interesting look at how Peter views authorities just in that moment. And I think when it's talking to the wives in this passage, he's not saying you have to do everything your husband says. He's saying you need to submit to and honour your husbands. But the bit that he says at the end there is that you need to do what's right. Now, right might not be what your husband is saying. And so there's this, I find in all three of these areas, there's this awkward tussle of submitting to our authorities, but living as a free child of God's and making choices about my behaviour that are right. And the example that you'll see here is, this is one I struggled with because he talks about Sarah in the Old Testament. Sarah's the wife of Abraham, and they have a difficult few moments. I won't go into it in too much detail. You can have a look yourself this week. But Abraham and Sarah are living in absolute poverty. There's a famine on, and they believe that they're going to die if they stay where they are. So they head down to Egypt. And Abraham says to his wife, he says, when we go there, she was obviously really good looking too, by the way, because he said, when we go there, don't tell anyone you're my wife, otherwise they're just going to kill me. And so they go down to Egypt, and Abraham's telling his wife, just be available, basically, which I just can't understand what Abraham was thinking. I think Abraham in that moment, to me, comes across as a complete pillock. I'd rather survive out in the wilderness than put my wife through that. Like, there's no way I'd be doing that to my wife. And here it doesn't say Abraham was following God's commands. Here the way I read it is Abraham was... anyway, you get my point. But here what he's saying is that Sarah submitted to her husband and did what was right, and in each of these three examples, and trusted God. And God protected her. The end of the story is Pharaoh has this dream that there's this woman in his household who's actually married, freaks him out, and he kicks Sarah out and gives them all these gifts to say, take her away, please. Why on earth did you let her come to me in the first place? So God looked after Sarah through that story. Now, I have this awkward tension through all of these because I want to submit to the authorities, and if I was a slave, which I'm not at all, submit, keep the peace, keep trying to live for God in the setting that you find yourself, but trust God and do what's right. And there's this awkward tension because I think it's a Baptist thing as well. I love fighting against systems and like standing up for what's right. But here he's saying yes, but do it with respect and submit to the authorities. There's this. Anyway, I'm doing too much of my opinion stuffing again here. Okay, slaves in reverent fear, submit yourselves to your masters, and if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, that's commendable before God. Jesus is our example, and when they hurled their insults at him, he didn't retaliate, but he suffered. He made no threats. I love the example of Jesus through that. In the same way, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, that they may be won over without words. Now, I've walked life beside several women who have husbands who think they've totally gone la-la because they follow Jesus. And life is tough for a woman who wants to give herself to God and also has to, according to this passage, submit herself to God. That is such a difficult journey to walk. You'll have people in your mind that pop up, I'm sure. We have to keep going back to chapter 1, verse 11 and 12. Why? 2, isn't it? Why are we doing it? It's because we are exiles and we want God to get glory through the behaviour and decisions that we make. And so we will keep living right lives. We won't just keep suffering under an abusive husband, but we will continue to be free and do what's right in that moment, submit to our husbands, submit to God, submit to our authorities, and trust that God's got us. That's an interesting line to walk through all that. My heart goes out to those women who and men as well who live with partners who don't believe in God. Because for me, my Christianity is what it guides, must be like 90% of my life. So how do I be married to someone who doesn't share that? That's a tough journey. So my heart goes out to him. But here Peter's saying, submit to God, do what's right, live a holy life so that your life keeps pointing to God and God will be glorified in the end and you can trust in him. That's a tough life. Likewise, we don't know many slaves, I suspect, but we have more slaves today than there has ever been on earth. Through the clothing industries, through mining in Congo, there are so many slaves, even in our developed countries. England has more slaves today than it's had in a long time, and it's just growing. Human trafficking is enormous. The sex trade is built on it. And so there are slaves everywhere. How do we help them to live right and for God, to find the love of God, and then to find their way through that? That's where this passage I find difficult to get down to. Really, this is how you must live, because life is complicated and difficult. But I love here that Peter keeps coming back to, you're in exile, live free, live for God, and do what's right, and he'll have you back. He'll look after you. Okay, Peter then talks to husbands, and he says, husbands, in the same way, be considerate to your as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you in this gracious gift of life. That's an interesting bit as well, because we're living in a society now that is fighting for equality, which, great, but one of the differences is that men are stronger than women. There is a difference, and this is one of the places in the New Testament where it actually describes the difference. I, as a man, will never know how it feels for a woman to walk alone on a dark street, because in my body, I assume that I can probably handle most of the trouble that comes up because I am stronger. There's a difference. And here Peter's saying, look, love your wives and look after them. Use your strength to care for them. And he says, for those of you who are in authority, use your authority to care for those who need it. And I love that. I love that thing. I don't love that our women are weaker and men are stronger sort of stuff, but for us men to use that strength to actually create safe spaces around us. For us to be a church that's safe is one of our big dreams, like that everyone feels safe in here. The other thing I'll say, I'm going to finish fairly soon. I've been talking a long time. I went with Anya to watch Billie Eilish's concert the other day. And I think I was the only male in the whole audience. It's all teenage girls pretty much, and young adult girls. Now, the fascinating thing for me, if you don't know Billie Eilish, she doesn't dress up pretty and feminine, but she is on her journey of redefining what a woman is. She's broadening the definition of woman, because she says, I'm a woman, I just don't fit in with all that pretty stuff. And she's fighting this thing. Now, in this passage, Peter says, stop going for gold and hairstyles and good clothing, because your real beauty is within. And I was watching thousands of young girls bawling their eyes out because Billie Eilish gets them. Now, today, in our wired-up digital way, for a young girl to grow up with all the anxiety that comes from image and desirability and being measured against the whole world rather than just your friend network, like our girls are growing up in a tough time. And I think this message needs to be super strong. Your beauty doesn't just come from your allure or the desirability. Your beauty actually comes from this deep within strength of you are a child of God's and you're choosing to live right. It's not your outward showcase. It's actually the beauty within. And I think watching that movie just highlighted how much pressure our girls are under to try and do the hair, the makeup and the jewelry and stuff, and to miss this thing of your beauty comes from within. And so you're watching Billie, she's still fighting to try and not have to fight to be pretty and to be noticed. You can see her talking through it at the end of the movie. She just wants to be herself and to be seen and valued, to love and to love. But she's got all this society stuff wanting her to put on pretty clothes. And it just tied in really well with what Peter was saying. And so Peter, he talks about suffering. It's going to be tough. He knows life is complicated. Believe me, he knows life is complicated. But he says, live as an exile. You are free. Jesus has set you free. And now use your freedom to be a slave for God. There's this funny, I think it's an oxymoron. You're free, but now you're a slave of God's. And so live right lives with courage. And so for us to work out what that means, this becomes even more striking when you remember that Peter wrote under rulers like Nero who deserved no respect. But he still says, respect those in authority. So I invite you into this dilemma. What does this mean for us today? Because Peter's writing to a first generation Greco-Roman culture. But what does it mean for us today? And that's our real journey. If you're in a life group, there are questions at the end of the sermon notes. I'd love you to rattle through this. I actually think what I've talked about today is more a lifelong discussion of us trying to work this stuff out than a sermon. I would love this to be more about discussion of what's your experience, what's God taught you through your life. How do you, for us who have authority, and I think most of us in this room have some level of authority, how do you use your authority for God's kingdom? Not for yourself, not for your own elevation and gain, but how do you use it for the lives around you? So I really encourage us to work through that. Now the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pray, is I feel like what Peter's saying to me through this talk is I want you to have a different perspective on life. Now, my normal perspective on life at the moment in this season is I wake up a bit tired. I wake up pretty tired. Yesterday was a big day. I woke up tired today. I wake up tired. I'm like, oh, life's pretty complicated. I might be saying too much here, but I guess I'll plod through today and see how it goes. That's a human normal Dan of how I wake up. Now, I think what Peter's saying here is I want you to wake up with this attitude instead. Thank you, God, for this opportunity to live for you today. Thanks for the freedom that you've given to me, and now I can live for your kingdom. And so whatever comes today, I will live for you wholeheartedly. Can you imagine if we as a people said that instead? Let's not just wake up and drudge through life. Let's actually be exiles. Let's actually live as though God is in charge. Wake up. All right, God, thanks for today. What are we going to do today? And that's been my prayer through this week as I've been getting ready for this sermon, is just this different paradigm of switch it so that we're not slaves to our sinful nature. We have been set free and let's live it. So let me pray. God, thank you for this opportunity we have today to live for your kingdom. Thank you for all that you've taught us. I'm so appreciative of Jesus and his teaching, and then Peter and Paul and others writing it down for us. Father, thank you for the way that they have taught us to live our lives. And Father, it's a challenge for us. How do we live under authority? How do we manage our households so that it all just points to you? Father, help us to live wholeheartedly for you and your kingdom, and to trust that you will look after us. No matter what happens, we have this eternal gift that's worth more than gold. And so thank you, Father. Help us to live in that perspective. Yeah. Amen.